So I'm Vivian Atsnasio. I'm a board-certified behavior analyst, and I started my career working with children in school districts with Terry and Jimmy long ago, and had some success in teaching guys how to decrease their challenging behaviors through the use of ABA. And then Terry said, oh, we have this grant in New York, and if we get it, would you come? I said, yeah, sure. And he said, we'll never get it, and so they got it, and so I went. So some of the folks you're going to see today was really the beginning of my work in New York and working with guys who were living in a state facility, locked wards for 25 years or more. And the world kind of moved on, and they had no idea. So we came in, and I said, Jim, we can't do this without you, so come on with us. And we hired some folks. It was a grant. We were able to get, at the time, I had 12 RBTs, which was a new credential at the time. And so they went through the 40 hours and their supervision, and that's a lot of support for, what do we have, 50 people. So that's a great situation. Then we also had 2 BCBAs that worked with us, and so we were able to get a lot done. And so what we're going to kind of look at is some of that work and what we've continued to do. What was interesting is at SUS at the time, they had just begun to roll out ABA in all of our group homes, and a lot of the staff, believe it or not, didn't really want to buy into all this extra work. So, the people in senior management really didn't know what the effects of ABA would be. And so when we were able to make these changes in quality of life for the adults we were serving in Brooklyn, the CEO, Donna Colonna, made a commitment to move this throughout the whole agency. So we have about 500 folks that get this technology on a daily basis and are hopefully, moving to better life. So what am I using to click? Oh, okay, so I'm doing it here, not the clicker thing. So I wanted to just start off to say that when I came into this, it was kind of thought that verbal behavior was its own method, or that it was Dr. Carbone's method in particular. And so although he liked the kudos, he did agree that it wasn't his method, right? And so verbal behavior is nothing new. It's been around since Skinner's analysis since 1957. And in 2007, Cooper, Heron, and Heward, in their book, Applied Behavior Analysis, added the chapter verbal behavior, just kind of making that distinction that verbal behavior is part of applied behavior analysis and that these procedures have been around a long time, and it was part of functional communication training back in the day, and it's these principles that we're still using today to move people to using verbal behavior as a replacement. So there's no specific procedures, there's no specific methods. It's the same principles and procedures we use for nonverbal behavior that now we're using Skinner's analysis for verbal behavior, right? So we look at motivation. What is the motivation of the learner? What do they want? What do they need? And then what are those SDs? Who's in the environment that suggests the availability of these, that the item is available? And then is the person reinforced? And then we also look at prompting and fading procedures, shaping, and schedules of reinforcement that will maintain this behavior over time. And that's where we start to talk about MAND training. So manding, for those of you who aren't familiar with the terminology, is just another word for requesting. And so today we're going to focus on what the definition and commitment of ABA is, the impact and correlation between language and problem behavior. And then I also wanted to take a moment to talk about the traditional and behavioral views of language, because for those of you who work with speech pathologists, this can be a point of contention sometimes. And so we want to kind of just make that distinction, how we're coming at it from different points of view. And verbal behavior, we'll go over verbal behavior, the definition, taxonomy. We'll review the characteristics of a MAND and the process, procedures, et cetera, for reducing problem behavior. I have some great case studies to kind of illustrate how we've done this. And then now that I'm not being split in half, well, we might actually have some time for questions. So that might work great. So as many of you know, this is the definition of ABA. It's a science that in which the tactics derived from the principles of behavior are applied systematically to improve the social significant behavior, and experimentation is used to identify the variables responsible for behavior change. So I'm going to laugh because you're going to see a bunch of these slides that have the same slide, but now it's in bold. Jimmy's like, this is what Jimmy's helped me put this together. He's like, this is what we're going for. So the point is that it's socially significant, right? So we're looking at behaviors that are going to help to improve the guy's life, right? So it has to be significant to the learner, right? And so today we're going to focus on the fact that social language can replace behavior and improve quality of life for individuals with ID. So, and how problem behavior, until we teach that language, is the response that they're using to gain access to the things that they want, right? Language is involved in everything, like academics, daily living skills, self-care, vocational, and employment, vocational and, recreation and leisure skills as well. But today we're gonna just, like I said, focus mostly on the language. So what's the impact? Well, the problem is if you can't speak or communicate, that's the challenge. You need a competent listener, right? So if you don't have a competent listener, the communication exchange is very limited, and it fails right from the onset. The individuals without the vocal ability have a stronger repertoire for problem behavior, because if they want something and they sit calmly in a room, nobody attends to them, right? Everybody's kind of happy that it's quiet. So if they start banging their head, now there's a need to come in, and now the suggestion that things are available become possible. So right now, what we're competent listeners for is problem behavior. So today, hopefully, I'm able to show you how to change that dynamic. So we want to reduce problem behavior by providing effective communication responses that replace the problem behavior. And I have some videos here. I'm going to show you Lou. He is, I guess he's about 40, early 40s. And he engages in quite a bit of challenging behavior. He has some vocal ability, but it's pretty limited. And so he's able to say some things, but he's not able to say enough. And so I'll let you see the video, and then I'll kind of talk about it a little bit. Let's hope it works.
Is absolutely illegal. And when you do that, you receive interest from the person money to. In any state, 35%. No. In this case, Liz, when they take the in the courtroom.
This is the plaintiff, Tom.
Relax.
Says he was exiting a parking lot and out of nowhere. The defendant crashed his bicycle into his car.
I'm gonna tell him here. Just put him in here.
Walking the bike lane.
Would you like the baby?
Yeah, what? No, you invite him to come out. Just put him in the other room. I'm gonna tell him.
He's suing the vampire.
So what happened here is that Lewis had an accident. He urinated on himself, and the staff is coming to him and saying, here's some pants for you to get changed. So when they approach him, he says, no, no, no. So he does have some vocal response. However, it's not enough, right? Do you all think that Lewis wants to stay in wet clothes? No, right? But there's something in the environment that is uncomfortable for him, right? So this SD is not offering availability, right? There's something that he needs to say that's more than no, no, no. So I don't know what that is, per se. It could be, I don't want to do it with you. I don't want to do it right now. I don't want to do it while Judge Wapner's on. So he needs additional language to help manage that situation better, right? And right now, it's not there. So I have another, do I hit escape? Okay. And then, so the same thing, I'm going to show you Stephen. How is this? So with Stephen, he's one of the guys that were in Brooklyn at the BDC. You could see Stephen has some stitches, right? That didn't get there on accident. He does that to himself. This was the first couple of days that SUS had taken over for the state, and it was a pretty scary situation for him. He didn't know any of us. So he woke up, just to give you a little bit about that. We took over at 8 o'clock in the morning. So we weren't allowed in until then. Some of the state workers were still on the premises, and they weren't happy to see us. So what they did was they hid all of the remote controls. This is fun. They took all of the individuals' clothes, put it in black bags, unmarked. And then they went over to the day program. They stopped up all the toilets, and and they left, right? So to say the least, the guys were pretty upset that morning, right? So we come in, we take them over to, everything's on the campus, we take them over to the day program, and we're kind of walking into this mess and trying to deal with it. But we're new faces to all these folks. And when you don't have a lot of language, you can't ask those questions. Who are you? Why are you here? Where did my staff go? Do you know about me? Do my parents know who you are? Is this safe? Right? So imagine how they're feeling, right? And so we had a great deal of problem behavior from people who may have been stable before we showed up, but it was a major, major change. And Stephen was one of those folks who really struggled with it initially. And when we did the intake, Stephen's two brothers are involved in his life and said they didn't believe that he would do well. And so in community living, and they wanted him to remain on the campus, and New York is shutting down all of the ICFs. So that wasn't an option for him. And so we said, you know, it'll be all right. We do this all the time. It's what we do. And Stephen's going to be okay. And his brother said, no, you don't know my brother. He's a monster. You can't take him out. He's going to beat people up. He's scary. He needs 2 or 3 people just to manage him. And we said, no, 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 we're going to teach him this stuff. So they go, Vivian, tell him what you're going to do. So I said, we're going to teach him to communicate, and his problem behavior is going to go away, and it's going to be super. And so it began. And so a couple of days into it, he banged his head so hard he had to go to the emergency room. He had gotten some stitches, and so he became our priority, although they all were, to just come up with some sort of intervention to kind of get this under control. And so this is the video of Jimmy working with him and one of the RBT, well, they weren't an RBT yet, but who turned into be one of the RBTs later. But I just kind of want to point out, like, Stephen has cauliflower ear. Like, these are not cupcakes. You know, his face is pretty deformed from the head banging that he does. His hands are calloused. They're very thick from the biting that he does. And we were under the impression that he was nonverbal. So you'll see sort of what's happening here.
Okay. You know what? It might be that maybe we're just too many.
Okay. So.
Can I just point something? So
I just want to, that wasn't the intervention, that's not the intervention. That was our first day with him. And we were just trying to see if he'd like to be around people. Clearly, we were trying to pay some attention to him. And as you can see, Stephen did not want us around. So we were kind of in the midst of kind of what's called a functional analysis. So this is kind of our control condition. So we're paying lots of attention to him. What we found was when we paid lots of attention to him, we got a lot of problematic behavior. When we ignored him to see if it was for attention, he was great. So, Vivian's going to show a little bit later is how do we make people who he doesn't want to be around, he wants to be around, use an effective means of communication. So again, this is not the intervention. This is us kind of figuring it out. We just want to show you this is what he kind of looked like. So I just want to preface that.
So that was the thing with Stephen is that he would prefer, so people were aversive to him. We weren't valuable. And he didn't see us as people who were SDs for availability for his favorite things or for things that he wanted to do. And you'll see a nice transformation with Stephen going forward. He's in a whole different place now, so you have that to look forward to. So getting into the conceptual views of language, traditional versus behavioral. So on the traditional side, speech therapists and others think or look at language as that the function is already assumed, right? So that words and phrases and sentences are the intent, right? And behaviorally, we look at it a little different. We see them as responses, right? And so it doesn't assume intent necessarily. And Lewis was kind of an example of that. He's saying no, right? But he's not making a choice to stay in wet clothes, right? So the intent isn't there. It's just that he doesn't have enough words to say. He has a weak repertoire, and that's what has to be developed. And we look at, behaviorally, we look at the formal properties of the response in the context of the function, right? And so that's really the key, is that it's not the sentence or the word, it's the context. And what does the individual need to say in that moment to be successful so that they could gain access to their reinforcement, right? So we look at antecedents. What's happening before? What's the motivation? What are the SDs in the environment, right? That suggest the availability of problem behavior or more appropriate responses, right? So it depends. Again, we're looking at those competent listeners. Who's around me? What kind of behaviors or responses do I have to engage in, to get me to my reinforcement? And so we're looking also at the consequences. Are people reinforcing me, my responses? Are people putting my responses on extinction? Are people punishing my responses, right? So we're looking, we want to set up situations that are a little bit more consistent. And that's the other thing. I was at a group home yesterday, and part of what we were talking about, I was doing, I had done a little intro to ABA, and then I was doing a little manding presentation for the staff, and we were talking about just morning routines, right? And so we were talking about this one gentleman who lives there, and one staff said, in the morning, he comes down and he's so happy. And another staff said, he's not happy in the morning. What are you talking about? And I said, well, something's happening here. And I said, well, what does the morning routine look like for you? And so the one staff member said, oh, well, I lay his clothes out, and I put his belt through his pants, and all he has to do is get dressed. And he comes down, and he's so angry. And so I said, well, then what do you do? And she said, well, I don't put his clothes out. I put them out, but I don't I kind of show him what we're doing, and I don't put the belt through his pants. And he comes down, and he's so happy. And I said, well, what do you think the difference is? So they said, well, we don't do it the same. That's the difference. I said, well, I think it's a little bit more than that, but okay. That's a start. Yeah, you're not doing quite the same. So the consequences and even the antecedents are a bit different, right? The environment is set up different for him to start. And the way that he's received, right? The way that the environment is responding to him is different, right? So does everybody in here drive? Right? So if you don't live in New York, a car is a very valuable thing, right? So when your car is broken, you're a little bit dependent on others, right? How does that feel? not so great, right? And so I reminded the staff that this is how our guys wake up every day. They really are the most resilient group of people in all of the world, right? That every day they wake up hoping we'll get it, right? Despite what happened yesterday, they hope today we'll get it. And they wake up cheery, and they see us, and they're like, we're gonna try this again. And then there's the belt in the pants. And no, not today, but we'll get you tomorrow. And so they smack us around a little bit, hoping that maybe that'll help and get us to go. But so what I was talking about is that they kind of wake up knowing that they're never gonna have 100% of a day, right? They're not gonna get that quality. But they come downstairs anyway. So if you needed someone to dress you, help toilet you, and do all of this, do you feel successful? How do you define your quality of life, right? So that's something I'm working on with SUS now. Everybody was happy that we passed audits, right? The state's happy, we get a check, we could stay open. That's the focus, right? And then I'd say, well, that's good. Well, what else are we doing right? Well, they're not going to the ER. Okay, that's also great. I don't go home and say, honey, I had a great day. I followed the rules and I didn't get to the ER today. Super, right? That's not how I define it. And I don't think we should have it defined like that for people with ID, right? I think that's kind of strange. And so my whole thing in New York is that if it feels weird and it sounds weird, it's weird, right? So they already have a hard enough time. They don't need for us to kind of, accent that part of it, right? So what we talked about is, how does this gentleman feel when he comes downstairs, when he puts his own pants on, he puts his own belt in his hoop, and he fastens it himself? That might be the only thing he has that day. That's a sad statement, but that might be all he has. And here it is that might be all he has, and he can't say to the folks that are helping him, hey, can you leave the belt alone? Or, why do you keep putting the belt in my pants? I'm 22 years old. Right? And when I said this to the staff, they said, well, I'm not trying to make them feel like that. No, of course not. That's never the intent. But how would you feel? I remember my grandmother had the beginning stages of Alzheimer's, and my mother went out, and she said, I was about 12 years old or something, and my mother went out for a short errand or something and said, stay with your grandmother. And so my grandmother decided she wanted to get dressed. Okay. And so she said, come on, I need your help. And, I was learning how to do my own bra, so I didn't really know how this whole thing happened. And so when I put it on her, I kind of lifted it up too much, So gravity happens when you're older. And so I figured I was embarrassed, right? And I was, I really wanted to be out of that situation. And so I said, well, she has Alzheimer's. By the time my mom gets home, she'll forget all about it, right? And so my mom came home. I didn't bring it up. And I said, I don't think I should stay alone with Nana anymore. I think she needs like a grown-up. And so my mom said, I'm sure you did fine. And then there goes my grandmother. Vivian brought my bra up to my ears, And so I was like, I'm sorry, I didn't know. But I made her feel uncomfortable. Wasn't my intent, right? It was hard enough that I had to see her undressed. I was 12. I didn't understand the idea of dignity at that time, but I knew I didn't want to be in the room, right? And so I think that it's important, and I kind of make these examples. I talk to you about this because I really want you to understand that ABA is not a science for people who have disabilities, but it's all human behavior. And when you learn the science, you could apply it in all situations. It'll help you with your husbands and your wives and your children. Not so much, right? When I'm on the phone, I am the one giving my child all the lollipops. And Kathy's in the back. We've had supervision at my house, and my daughter was, 2. I think she had like 12 ice pops one night. I'm like, I just got to get through this. So, but the point is that we look at things in the context, right? It's not just what's said. It's not what it appears. It's what is needed to make the situation successful. And so I bring all this up to say we really want to think about life from the eyes of the individual, right? And I brought this up yesterday too. For those of you who do work in group homes, it's kind of a strange situation, right? Because it's your workplace, but it's their home. And so I made the point yesterday to say, like, when you come in, the guys are so happy to see you. So they charge you, right? And I said, what is your response to them? I said, first of all, do you knock when you come in? No. You wouldn't walk into my house, would you? Well, we work here. Okay, but you don't live here, right? So that's the first, so this is how we set it up, you know? So I kind of want to say, like, to teach manding is one thing, but you're looking at the whole person. They have to respect you, right? So to even get in front of them to sit, you know, you kind of have to develop that a little bit. And so you want to think about the way that you're interacting with him the rest of the day, right? Otherwise, you cut up all these nice little cookies and stuff, and they're going to throw it at you, right? So that doesn't change, right? So you have to put a little time. And so you want to come in, you want to say hello, and you want to kind of be respectful and not say, oh, I got to send a fax, because you wouldn't come into my house and kind of just walk right past them and do that, right? You have to hear them out. And so, again, that sets up the context, because from a functional point of view, if you keep kind of putting them aside, you're setting up a motivation for attention, right? And so then they're going to need to get your attention in another way, right? So it's not like we just teach manding and it's this separate entity that sits in the middle of the kitchen. It's all day, right? It's not just meal times. Like people say, oh, well, do we do manding at lunchtime? Is that the only time you ask for stuff? You know, no, you ask for things all day long. You need information all day long. And so that's why we want to look at this, of what's going on in the environment. What motivations are being contrived? Do people need to escape a situation? Do people need to gain access to a situation? Are they not feeling well? What's sort of going on, and what kind of information do we need? In 1957, Skinner wrote Verbal Behavior, and in there he wrote that all actions of a person are mediated or reinforced by a response from a listener who is specifically trained to respond to that person's behavior, right? So that's the key, is that they're specifically trained. There's that bold again. They're specifically trained to respond to the person's behavior. So right now, we're competent listeners for problem behavior. When we walk in the room, we're sort of suggesting that the only thing that I really understand is when you bang your head, right? And so we want to change that into, when I walk into the room, I don't respond to banging your head. Instead, I signify the availability of appropriate responses that are going to gain you access to your reinforcer, right? So that's what manding does. Oh. Yeah, so, this is a great video. See, I knew I've missed this kind of tiny stuff. So anyway, we have Jason. He also came out of Brooklyn Developmental Center. He's deaf. He has autism. And he has no family, right? So when we screened him, he had a sign language interpreter for him. And so when we took over, the person we hired, didn't show up. And the person we hired was the state person, and so they didn't show up. And so it's pretty hard to find these folks, right, that want to work full time. And so we had to kind of be a little bit more creative. So we sent the program director, the person who was managing the house, we sent her to sign language classes so that she could then train everybody in the house to communicate and become competent listeners to him. So Jason kind of has this very specific repertoire of responses where he talks about finding a girlfriend, moving out, and getting married and having a baby. And that's all he says. And so because that's all he says, we kind of thought that's all he could say, right? And then you'll see Ashley goes and she takes these classes, and all of a sudden he looks a lot more competent, right? Because now he has a competent listener. So this is Jason at baseline. Oh, what happened? So that's kind of cute, but it's not so cute. It's because Amy is a BCBA, but she's not a competent listener, right? So basically he's saying, I want a woman, and then she says, I want a woman, and then he says, I want to get married, and she says, I want to get married, and so then he says, and I want to move out, and she says, I want to move out, and that's not so great, right? She's just imitating his behavior, right? So imagine I said, I want dinner, and my husband said, I want dinner. It's not helping, right? It's not a good situation here. So, yeah.
So just a quick point. Anybody speak sign language here fluently? Great. So we don't. So one of the things about Jason is, as we were trying to communicate with him, we had one guy who became our designated sign guy because he knew maybe 6 signs and we only knew 5. So he kept getting, unfortunately, kept getting beat up. So we said, John, what's going on? What's going on? And correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, that's right.
Your intonation is in your face. So when Jason couldn't communicate, he couldn't get his needs met, people were telling him, so in sign language, it's like, you have to calm, right, right. So it's like, so we were like, John, what's going on? So John would like, tell him to calm down. I go, well, how do you tell him to do it? He's like this. So, in a sense, he's saying, calm down! You need to calm down! We couldn't figure it out. Everyone's like, I told him to calm down! So, competent listener does help.
Yeah. Oh, why does it keep doing that? Okay.
Okay.
Oh, the other guy, I don't think he's. We've never seen him. The little guy with beard.
Just want to know what else.
So I tried to pause it. So I just want to make that point. When he looks at the camera the first time, what she's saying is, they don't know what you're saying. You have to slow down, right? And so he goes, oh, I understand. These are the idiots. All right, I got it. So she says, what's your name? He's like, Jason. She goes, you don't look so happy. He's like, yeah, well. So right there, he was holding an iPad, right? Because we weren't competent listeners. So he had a program on his iPad with some pictures, because when he would do this, some of the staff took offense, right? And he wanted a well-endowed woman. And so some of the female staff, got a little upset. They're like, he's cursing at me. He's making advances. And or he would try to tell the story to other peers that were males. And they're like, he's coming on to me. I'm like, he's not coming on to you. So right now, as Ashley, as a competent listener, is talking with him, he's holding his device. So he has to actually put the device down so he could use his hands. So that's kind of a nice point.
He's gonna talk to you later.
So,
Remind me of eternally later.
so this is his story again, about how he wants to move out. So he's saying he's going to move out in December. So he says he wants a baby. So she's asking him, what kind of girls do you like? And he says, I don't like black girls. So she says, do you have a girlfriend? So he says, no, but I want to get married to a beautiful girl. So now she breaks it up and she says, where do you want to live? In Queens? In Manhattan? In Queens, he says, or Manhattan. She goes, right now we're in Brooklyn. He says, I don't like Brooklyn. So he's saying he's going to move out of Brooklyn, and he's glad she understands. He's leaving in December. Get married, have a baby.
He has two sisters. Okay, he's the oldest. So. Or Manhattan. Okay. All right, fine. Let me describe to him what you said. So when he moves to Queens or Manhattan, he's gonna get a white girlfriend. He's gonna live in a group home, and they're gonna have a baby.
That's how you say it.
So he looks a lot different, right, with a competent listener. That was a nice, it was a nice exchange, and and when Ashley's not around, there's not a lot of competent listeners, so the exchanges don't go nearly as long. And so imagine that motivation for attention as the hours of the day kind of pass, so that when we walk through the door, for the few of us who know at least a handful of signs, he runs to us, right? We're like a magnet, because he hasn't been able to talk to anyone all day, right? And he has all these things going on. Another interesting piece about a competent listener is that when the day hab was assessing his skills, they wrote up goals, and one of the goals was safety signs. And so that was one of the meetings the state actually came to, and so they said, what are you teaching him that for? He knows that. And we said, no, he doesn't. We put out all the signs, and we ask him to pick it up, and he doesn't pick it up, and she goes, no. Go get the signs. So she lays them out, and she knew sign language, and so she's asking him, I don't know the signs, but she's asking him, what's the stop sign, what's the yield sign, or whatever it was, and 100% accuracy, right? And so how many others are we underestimating, right? Because we think that this is all they have, when the problem is really us. Right? We're not the competent listener. And I think that's what Skinner was getting at, is that we have to look at this. And so in addition to the man, which is what we're going to focus on today, Skinner describes several verbal operants. The man is when you ask for reinforcers that you want because you want it, right? So you ask for your shoes because you want to put your shoes on, right? Attacked is when you're labeling, essentially. You're naming or identifying objects, actions, or events because you see them, you're commenting on them, right? So you see the shoes, and you say shoes, right? You don't want the shoes, you're just saying that they're shoes. And intraverbal is when you're answering questions or having a conversation. It's where the words are controlled by other words, right? There's no point-to-point correspondence. So you say shoes because I say, what do you wear on your feet, right? So me saying, what do I wear on my feet, does not in and of itself evoke your response. Shoes, you have to bring that up yourself, right? So echoic, you kind of repeat what you hear. You say shoes after someone else says shoes. Imitation, copying someone's motor movements as they relate to sign language in this case, tapping your fists together when someone else taps their fists together for shoes, right? Textual, reading written words, saying shoes because you see the written word shoes. Copying text, so writing the word shoes because someone else wrote the word shoes on the board or something, and then transcription, spelling the words because you see it, right? What Skinner pointed out is that each one of these operants are mutually exclusive from the other. So it means that I could ask for shoes, but it doesn't mean I could talk about them. It doesn't mean I could label them. It doesn't mean I could write the word. It doesn't mean I could copy the word. And so all of this has to be taught. And kids that are developing, typically, this stuff just sort of evolves, right? But with our guys, especially guys that have a stronger repertoire of language, we kind of overestimate their abilities, right? So you think because they could have somewhat of a conversation with you that they get it. They get all of it, and they don't. And that's where we go wrong. I sit at a lot of IEP meetings where I'm speaking with the speech and language teacher, and I say, this guy needs language. And they go, are we talking about the same kid? He talks. Yeah, I get that. But he can't say what he needs to say when he needs to say it. And that's the problem, right? So if you're upset and you can't explain why you're upset, then you don't have the language you need, right? If you're hungry for something, right? If you're kind of still being taught in the way that functional communication was initially introduced with more generalized mands, right? Where we're teaching eat and drink, but we're not specifying. There are times where maybe some of you after lunch or dinner are looking for some dessert, and somebody will say, you'll say, what do you have for dessert? If they said cake, would that be enough for you to request it? Or does it matter what the cake is, right? Maybe you have some allergies, right? So you need to know what the choices are more specifically. So now all this guy has is cake. So the cake shows up and, it's cheesecake and there's eggs in it and he's allergic to eggs, and so now we can't eat it. So he really was hoping to eat that dessert and now he can't eat it because it's not the right kind of cake. And he can't send it back and he can't ask if there's others, right? And so life becomes pretty dismal without, this technology. And so, but that's where they are. And so we have to go in and we have to teach these things specifically. So at Chimes, they have a program for kids on the spectrum, and this is what they're doing. They're sitting down with the kids and they're teaching through their lesson plans how to have them request some things, how to label and talk about it using the VB map and the ABLES, which are common assessments to guide teaching of this sort of programming. And it kind of gives you, we've actually done it with the adults. We've done the VB map with them, and to kind of get a guide of where they are, where are the holes, where can we start? Because to just sort of assume, you're going to waste a lot of time, right? And you need to know where it sort of falls apart. So with the MAND, it functions as the request for when you want something, right? So it's made of the motivation, the SD, the response, and the consequence. So there has to be some motivation and a listener present for it to work, right? And the response can be vocal, sign language, you could use a picture. Some people may have device, if you could write or type. Those are also appropriate forms. And then the consequence is to get that specific reinforcer that was requested, right? So this is a great place to start because this is, of all the operants, the MAND is the one that services the speaker, right? So I want something, I ask for it, and I get it. Different than, kind of just saying, oh, there's a bird, right? That's more of a social reinforcement. And if I don't value that as much, or if I don't communicate as effectively, that's not going to be so helpful just to kind of walk around labeling things. It doesn't help me gain access to the things that I want when I want them. So the MAND is a good place to start. So the word MAND comes from demanding or commanding, and it's when you, again, asking for what you want. So I gave a couple examples. So when you're hungry and you have the motivation for food, you see a person who has given you food in the past, and then you sign or say cookie, and then you get a cookie, right? That's one example of a MAND with an item. You could also request attention, right? So you could be deprived, and I always go over this. So in the world of ABA, we use words like deprivation and punishment, and it scares the heck out of everybody else, right? So I'm not suggesting neglect, right? We're not beating anybody up and sticking them in a room. This is just like for a moment, it could be just for a moment in some cases, that you turn your back and you're just walking to get something for the individual, and in that moment, they were motivated for your attention, and now you're not there. So in that sense, they're being deprived, right? So a person is deprived of attention for some period, the motivation increases, they see a person, they understand that it's available now, and they say, excuse me, come here, look at me, see what I have, and they receive the person's attention. Right now, what typically happens is they bang their head and someone says, what's going on, right? So that's what we're trying to change. Another thing is, sometimes for all of us, we're in situations that are less preferred, right? And maybe we can't tolerate working for as long a period, or maybe we're willing to do it if we could do it in the order of preference for non-preferred situations, right? So if I have to sit down and do my taxes, you know, I'll start first with just organizing things first, right? The last thing you want to do is go to the accountant. You don't really want that information, right? So you kind of put that off to the last part. So it's the same thing for the individual. So they need to, again, have the motivation to want a break or have some kind of change in the environment, and then they could say no, and then the activity is delayed or terminated. People are always surprised that no is a command. And I talk about when you're little and you have kids and you tickle them, what's the first thing they say? No, stop, right? And so people don't think of it that way, but we all need to terminate some activity. You might tell me to stop pretty soon, right? Vivian, get off that stage. So there are times when it's important that we are in a position where we could request the end of an activity or to change it. Some of the other things that we can consider is requesting missing things, right, from completing a task, you know. So you buy a new dress, you put it in your closet, you're getting dressed in the morning, and you have to take the tag off, right? So now you need scissors, right? So maybe you don't have scissors in your bedroom. So now you're looking around for an SD to suggest, oh, scissors might be here, right? And so, or you're going to ask someone, you know, kind of what it looks like in my house in the morning is, help, you know, like my husband is Rick, can you get me the scissors? Nothing's ever where it's supposed to be. And that's kind of what it looks like in my house. And so you call out and you ask for that help. And so kind of by doing that, I'm also asking for some attention, right? So these things can, you know, be combined a bit. And then we need information. This is a big piece. You know, in the ABLES and the VB map, it's sort of suggested in a developmental order how we teach these things, and information comes a little bit later. However, for some individuals, this is very important to them, and you might have to kind of teach it sooner than later because it's what they want to know. A great example I have for this is years ago I was working with this youngster, Andre. And he loved food. Like, that was his greatest reinforcer ever. And his mother was awesome. She got it. So she went out and she bought, from Toys R Us, she bought like the McDonald's stand, she bought the Taco Bell, she bought all these different things. Then she bought like this little CD player and the thing that looked like a movie theater, because he loved cars, right? So she really got it. So we drew this big map, and he would drive his car to all these different things, and he would have to ask. So she would go out and get all this food from all these different places, and he would drive up to Taco Bell, and he would have to say, you know, I want the pizza, or I want the nachos, and then he would, you know, drive to the next place, and we would give him little pieces of all this stuff, and he had a ball with it. So one day we're down there, and he said, donut, I want donut, and I said, okay, well, you have to ask Mom, because that wasn't in the house, so it meant we had to go out. So he goes upstairs, and he tells his mom, I want a donut, and she said, you do a good job with Vivian, we'll get a donut. So we go through his program, and we go upstairs, and we said, oh, he did such a great job, and in the car we go. So as we're driving, he starts screaming, donut, 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 and so I'm in the front seat, and Mom says, see, this is what I'm talking about, fix this. I don't know, I guess he's just, you know, really wanting to get to that donut, that's all I got. And so I said, I'm going to need a little bit more time with this. And he's steady, donut, donut, donut. So now we pull up to Dunkin' Donuts, and he's screaming donut. So I said, well, I got nothing, because he's been to Dunkin' Donuts enough to know that we've arrived. And I go, let's go in. So we go in, still upset, donut, donut, donut. And I'm like, which donut do you want? And I'm pointing. And so then Mom gets it. Thank God for moms, right? So she goes, he wants Krispy Kremes. I said, I didn't even know there was a Krispy Kreme in this town, right? But it's the truth. Are there times where you don't want the chocolate chip and you want the Oreo? Well, isn't he entitled to that as well, right? But he didn't have that ability to ask for that specifically. So Mom, again, getting it the way she does. She bought a half a dozen Dunkin' Donuts and a half a dozen Krispy Kremes, and we went back and we went man crazy, so that he could kind of learn. But the other thing I taught him with respect to information is I taught him where. So now when Mom made the wrong turn, he could say, where are we going, right? He didn't really have to understand, so to speak, what that phrase meant, but it shaped the listener's response, and it got him the information he needed. So in terms of his learning profile, he wasn't really ready for me to teach that man yet. However, he needed that in that situation. So if he said to his mother, where are we going? She could say Dunkin' Donuts, and he could say, no, no, right? And then she could say Krispy Kreme, right? So I didn't have to teach him all that language. I just had to shape it up enough so that Mom could be a competent listener. Does that make sense? And so that's all we're looking to do, at least to start, right? Hopefully we could keep building on it. But these are important questions. Like a lot of times we'll say, whether you're working with children or adults, you'll tell them, okay, we're going to the park. Let's go. Now, some people may wonder, which park? Why are we going to the park? Today's a Thursday. We usually go to the park on Friday. They may say, who's going? Because if that noisy guy's going, I don't want to go, right? How are we getting there? I hate that van. Or where do I have to sit? If we go on the van, where do I have to sit? So these are all things, this is all information that they need to be able to ask, but because they can't ask, right, we say, oh, they have a problem with transition, right? I don't know that it's such a problem with the transition. So the issue is now they get to the van, they see that noisy guy's going, and they're sending him in the back to sit right next to him. Wow, right, we get it all. Yeah, kicking, screaming, biting, flopping to the floor is very effective at that point, right? We're not going anywhere. Or biting someone, right? We can't go with you attached to someone else. We have to break this all down. And so it at least delays us going to the park. But if we were able to give this language to them earlier, they would have a real choice, an informed choice about going to the park, right? That they don't really have right now. And so do you guys have any examples of things that people you work with would need to ask for? I think I kind of got all of them. Okay, told you. So, okay, how we say, we put in these participation things, but nobody really wants to talk. You came to listen, right? So what are we talking about? So what is the importance of manding? Well, like I said, it's the first repertoire that's learned, and it produces the immediate benefit to the individual. So you get what you ask for, and it teaches you that verbal behavior is valuable. So for those of you who are working with children, you see this, right? So a lot of times the parents will say, they're regressing. No, they're finally hitting their terrible twos, right? They might be 50, but that's what's going on here. When a little kid learns that what they say controls their environment, it becomes a little bit hectic in the house, right? And so it's like, no, 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 why, right? And so it's not any different for individuals. I often talk about that transition from childhood to adulthood, right? Where, as a kid, you have absolutely no rights in the world. Your mother and father control everything. And then 21 in a day, the world is yours. The oyster opens. And so we have staff who go, oh, he doesn't want to go anywhere. What are you talking about? He used to go. The mother's like, what do you do? He used to love going out. Well, now you say, come on, Charlie, let's go out. No. Okay. So we have, Hans works with me in New York. We have a guy, pretty big guy, just transitioned to us. And this is what happened to him. He's a big guy. He's been taking like banisters off the wall and, knocking people down. A lot of people are out of work with their feet up now and enjoying their time. And so they would kind of go in and they would say, hey, you want to go out? No. Okay, good. Just what I was hoping to hear, right? And so, so we had a meeting, and The regional director said, Vivian, you got to get all your behavior people here. We need them 5 days a week, all day long, all the time. And we need men. We need all men because he's a big guy and he's killing our females. And I said, well, we just got to train the females, right? And so they said, well, I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's enough. And she was like shaking her finger at me and I said, it's going to be okay, right? We're going to write a plan here. It's all going to get better. And so thankfully, between Jimmy and Hans, it has improved some. So, but that's what we had to teach him. We had to teach him, I had to teach the staff that when he said no, that wasn't his intent. He wasn't making a choice. Nobody wants to stay isolated in their room 24/7. That's not what they're getting at. And nobody really wants to beat you up. But that's the only way you listen, right? So if that's what you have to do, then I guess I have to beat you up. So now he's in the position, this guy's in the position where he could ask for things, and we were able to pair up the female staff. So mom used to come. So it was a great story. So, and this is where that kind of transition of no was also an issue. So for those of you who work in group homes, you'll appreciate this. So he was at Woods. He was living at Woods in Pennsylvania, and his family is from the Bronx. So mom was trucking down to Philly every weekend to visit him, and now he's back home. So now, they are just so happy to be together. They love each other. They get to visit. So who's more valuable than mom? But the problem is, when is she showing up, right? So he wasn't able to ask that. He could say quite a few words, but he can't say, when is mom coming, or why isn't mom coming? Okay. So we had to teach some of those requests. We had to put that in the plan. And we had to come up with the schedule. What I wanted to do is kind of be in a place where I could evoke it, right? So one of the ideas was to have a schedule where we have a picture of mom in the house when she's coming to visit, so we could put that on the schedule because he could read. We have pictures with him when he could have phone calls with her, when he could have FaceTime with her, because that's different levels of a visit, right? That's different kinds of interactions. And so he doesn't have all this language yet. We're in the process of teaching it. So in the hopes of reducing some of his challenging behavior, we put some additional cues and prompts in his day so that so that hopefully it would evoke the language, right? And that he would kind of have a better idea of what to expect. The other thing is that so mom said, the staff is no good. I said, oh, what'd they do? And she said, well, it's like 100 degrees out, and I go to visit him, and there's no air conditioning on in his room. I said, well, that doesn't sound right. So let me find out what's going on with that. So I asked the staff, and they go, no, we put it on, and he tells us to shut it off. And so we put it on, and he tells us to shut it off. And so mom came, and it was off. And I said, well, did you show mom that exchange? And she said, no. I said, well, mom thinks you're making him sweat, right? So you have to kind of explain it. So now mom thinks she has to be here all the time because you're not taking good care of her son, right? So that's not a good way to set it off. And mom didn't understand why we were listening to him. She said, it's 100 degrees. I don't care if he says no air conditioning. You got to put it on, right? And so I said, well, we have this thing called human rights. And so if he wants to sweat, it's his choice, right? But again, but it could be, right? He doesn't have the language to say, I don't like the noise. Maybe there's a sensory response to this, and so it makes him feel a little bit uncomfortable. So that's one of the issues. What else? So it's also essential for the development of other kinds of VB, and it acts as a proactive intervention. In Cooper, he talks about antecedent interventions and talks about the importance of how when we can create the SDs and the motivation in the environment, we can evoke these responses and have the guys get access to reinforcers, and that will move the motivation for problem behavior, the other way, and so it will decrease it overall and ultimately replace the problem behaviors.